Officer James Miller's flashlight beam cut through the heavy rainfall, illuminating the glass pane of the Willow Creek Library's front entrance. It was 11:42 p.m. on October 14, 1984. The heavy oak door, usually bolted shut by 9 p.m., stood ajar by 3 inches. Miller pushed the door open with a gloved hand, his other hand resting on his holstered service revolver. He called out, identifying himself, but the only response was the hum of the building's heating system and the rhythmic drumming of Oregon rain against the roof. He stepped into the foyer. The inner lights were dimmed, but the main desk lamp was still on, casting a yellow circle over a stack of returned books. Miller walked behind the circulation desk. A purse, made of brown leather and showing signs of wear on the strap, sat open on the stool. Beside it lay a set of car keys with a small brass rabbit keychain. Miller keyed his radio. He requested a detective. The scene was static, undisturbed, and entirely wrong. Detective Marcus Thorne arrived 20 minutes later. The rain had turned the unpaved overflow lot into a slurry of mud, and he noted the precise position of the solitary vehicle parked near the staff entrance, a beige 1978 Honda Civic. The engine block was cold to the touch. Thorne moved systematically, stepping carefully to avoid contaminating the ground leading to the library steps. He was a man who preferred grid paper to intuition, and tonight the lack of chaos bothered him more than signs of struggle would have. Thorne entered the library. He instructed Miller to remain by the door and began his preliminary walkthrough. He noted the visual baseline of the room. The shelves were orderly. The janitorial cart was parked in the alcove, mop bucket dry. There were no overturned chairs, no scuff marks on the linoleum, and no shattered glass. The silence in the room felt heavy, pressurized by the storm outside. He reached the circulation desk and put on a pair of latex gloves. He examined the purse. Inside, he found a wallet containing an Oregon driver's license issued to Elena Vance, aged 28. There was $42 in cash, a tube of lip balm, and a pack of gum. Nothing had been taken. This was the first critical data point. The motive was not robbery. Thorne moved to the back office. The employee schedule was pinned to a corkboard. Elena Vance was the closing librarian, scheduled from 1 p.m. to 9 p.m. It was now past midnight. Thorne picked up the phone on the desk, wrapping the receiver in a handkerchief, and dialed the number for Elena's home address listed in the file. It rang 12 times before he hung up. He returned to the front desk and looked at the daily log. The library used a physical checkout system. Patrons signed their names and the book titles on a ledger sheet. Thorne did not touch the paper yet, but he leaned in close. The last signature was scrawled at 8:45 p.m. He noted the time. 15 minutes before closing. Thorne walked back outside to his cruiser and retrieved a Nikon F3 camera. He began the process of freezing the scene in time. Flash. The open door. Flash. The purse on the stool. Flash. The keys. Flash. The muddy footprints near the entrance, likely Miller's, but documented nonetheless. This was the inception of the forensic timeline. Every photograph taken in the next hour would serve as the only objective window into the past for the next 40 years. By 6 a.m. on October 15th, the scope of the operation shifted from a welfare check to a search and rescue. The sunrise revealed the density of the terrain surrounding the library. Willow Creek was nestled against the foothills of the Cascade Range, a landscape defined by dense Douglas fir, steep ravines, and aggressive undergrowth. Thorne established a command post in the library's parking lot. He unfolded a topographical map on the hood of his car, weighting the corners with rocks. The grid system was drawn by hand. He divided the immediate 2-mile radius into 4 quadrants. Without GPS technology, the search relied on compass bearings and line-of-sight coordination. The initial search team consisted of 12 deputies and 20 volunteers. Thorne briefed them with clinical brevity. He held up the photograph of Elena Vance, a woman with dark hair pulled back, wearing a cardigan and reading glasses. "We are looking for a person or articles of clothing," Thorne said, his voice flat and projecting over the sound of the idling trucks. "Do not touch anything you find. Mark it. Signal. Wait for me." The line search began at 0700 hours. The men moved shoulder to shoulder, spaced 10 feet apart, walking into the tree line behind the library. Thorne stayed at the perimeter, monitoring the radio traffic. The technology of 1984 limited their reach. There were no drones to scan the canopy, no thermal cameras to detect heat signatures in the brush. It was a manual, analog effort, pitting human eyes against millions of square feet of forest floor. At 10:30 a.m. a radio crackled. "Sector 2, we have something." Thorne moved into the woods. The ground was soft, a mixture of pine needles and saturated loam. He found the deputy standing near a cluster of ferns, about 300 yards from the library's rear exit. The deputy pointed to the ground. A scarf, blue and grey wool, was snagged on a low branch of a huckleberry bush. Thorne crouched. He didn't touch it. He looked for disturbance in the soil around it. The heavy rain from the previous night had washed away surface details, smoothing the mud into a featureless paste. This was the first significant loss of data. If there had been footprints, the weather had erased them. Thorne photographed the scarf in situ. He then used sterile tweezers to lift it, placing it into a brown paper evidence bag. Plastic bags were standard for many things, but Thorne knew that wet fabric in plastic bred mold, which destroyed biological evidence. He didn't know that 40 years later, Dr. Aris Thorne would need the fibers to remain chemically stable, but his adherence to strict preservation protocols in 1984 saved the sample. The search continued for 3 days. The radius expanded to 5 miles, then 10. They brought in tracking dogs on the second day, but the continuous rainfall made the scent trail fractured and unreliable. The dogs circled the library parking lot, agitated, but refused to commit to a direction into the woods. They kept returning to the asphalt, suggesting Elena might have entered a vehicle, but the lack of tire tracks other than her own and the staff's made this difficult to corroborate. On October 18th, Thorne shifted the focus from the field to the residence. He executed a warrant to search Elena Vance's small rental house on the edge of town. The goal was to build a biological and psychological profile. The house was neat, mirroring the state of the library. Thorne moved through the rooms, cataloguing items. He found a calendar in the kitchen. The date of October 14th was blank. The previous days had mundane entries, quote 3, quote 4, quote 5. In the bathroom, Thorne focused on biological retention. He found a hairbrush on the vanity. It was full of dark strands. He bagged the entire brush. He collected a toothbrush. He pulled the trap from the sink drain and emptied the contents into a jar. In 1984, DNA profiling was in its infancy, barely a theoretical concept for rural law enforcement. Alec Jeffreys would not publish his seminal paper on DNA fingerprinting until 1985. Thorne collected these items not for genetic sequencing, but for blood type comparison and microscopic hair analysis. He was banking evidence for a science that did not yet exist. He returned to the library on October 20th. The yellow tape was still up, but the urgency had dissipated, replaced by the slow, crushing weight of a cold case forming. Thorne sat at the circulation desk, inhabiting the last known space of the subject. He opened the drawer and removed the checkout ledger. He needed to interview everyone who had been in the building that day. The list contained 22 names. Over the next 6 weeks, Thorne tracked down and interviewed 21 of them. They were students, retirees, local mothers. Their stories corroborated the timeline. Elena was there. She was calm. She checked out books. She smiled. The 22nd name was illegible, a scrawl of ink that looked like quote 6 or quote 7. The timestamp was 4:15 p.m. Thorne spent weeks cross-referencing library card numbers, but the number listed next to the name was missing a digit. It was a clerical error, or a hurried entry. It became a dead spot in the data. By December 1984, the physical search was suspended. The winter snows had begun to fall, burying the Cascade foothills in white silence. The investigation moved entirely to paper. Thorne built a timeline of Elena's life, stripping it down to data points. Financial records showed no unusual spending. Telephone records showed no unknown callers. She was a woman who lived a quiet, structured life, and then simply ceased to exist. Years passed. The timeline extended into the 1990s. In May 1992, a teletype came through from a precinct in Spokane, Washington. A woman matching Elena's description had been arrested for shoplifting. She was disoriented and refused to give a name. Thorne, now 8 years older and carrying the weight of the open file in his posture, drove 6 hours north. He stood behind the one-way glass in the Spokane precinct. He watched the woman in the interrogation room. She had the same dark hair, the same build. For a moment his heart rate spiked. He signaled the attending officer to go in and ask her about Willow Creek. The woman didn't react to the name. She didn't react to the photo of the library. Fingerprint analysis later that afternoon confirmed she was a runaway from Idaho named Sarah, with a history of mental health episodes. Thorne drove back to Oregon in silence. The false lead was a bitter pill, but it served a forensic purpose. It forced a re-evaluation of the original file. Thorne returned to the precinct basement, where the Vance file was kept in 3 banker's boxes. He began a systematic audit of the physical evidence, a process he repeated every few years. He checked the seal on the bag containing the scarf. He checked the vials of soil he had scraped from the wheel wells of Elena's Honda. The soil samples were of particular interest to him. In 1984, he had sent them to the state lab, which confirmed the soil was consistent with the dirt in the library parking lot and Elena's driveway. It was a non-result. But Thorne kept the vials. He labeled them, quote, 8 and, quote, 9. He placed them in a cool, dry section of the evidence locker, ensuring the chain of custody remained unbroken. In 1995, Marcus Thorne was preparing for a partial retirement. He would stay on as a consultant, but he was handing over his active caseload. He spent his final week as lead detective organizing the Vance boxes. He wanted them ready for whoever picked up the torch next. It was late, the precinct quiet. Thorne sat under the fluorescent hum of the records room. He had the 1984 library checkout log spread out on the table. He had looked at this document 1,000 times. He knew the names. He knew the times. He ran his finger down the column of dates. October 14th, 1984. His finger stopped. He pulled a magnifying glass from his drawer. He focused on the margin of the page, the area usually reserved for the librarian's initials verifying the return of books. He had focused so heavily on the checkout list, the people taking books out, that he had paid less attention to the return column. There, on the line for a copy of The Hunt for Red October, which had been checked out 2 weeks prior by a local teacher, was a checkmark indicating it had been returned. The return date was stamped October 14th. But the initials next to the stamp were not, quote, 10 for Elena Vance. The handwriting was jagged, sharp, and distinctly different from the smooth loops Elena used in every other entry that day. The initials appeared to be double quote 11, double quote. Thorne froze. He flipped back through the previous months of logs. Elena worked every Tuesday night. He checked the Tuesdays. Quote 12, quote 13, quote 14. He went back to October 14th. He looked at the timestamp for the return. 8:55 p.m. 5 minutes before closing. 10 minutes after the last patron signature. Elena Vance had not been the person who checked that book back in. Someone else had stood behind the desk, used the stamp, and signed their own initials, or initials that meant something to them, moments before Elena vanished. Thorne realized with a sickening drop in his stomach that the perpetrator hadn't just taken her, they had assumed her role, however briefly, to close out the ledger. The discrepancy had been hiding in plain sight for 11 years. Thorne's breath hitched, a harsh, ragged sound in the empty room that seemed to echo off the metal filing cabinets. He stared at the initials, his eyes burning from strain and the dry, recycled air of the precinct. MT. The letters were etched in black ballpoint ink, the pressure heavy, almost tearing the thin paper of the ledger. Unlike Elena's flowing script, which seemed to glide across the lines with the practiced ease of someone who loved the order of the library, these letters were architectural, brutalist. The vertical strokes of the M were parallel pillars. The crossbar of the T was a flat, angry slash. He sat back, the cheap office chair groaning under his weight, and rubbed his face with both hands. The friction made his skin hot, but inside, his blood felt like slush. For 11 years, he had been haunted by the empty spaces in the case, the lack of witnesses, the lack of a body, the silence that had swallowed Elena Vance. He had built a cathedral of theories on the foundation of that silence. But he had been wrong. There had been noise. There had been a presence. Someone had stood at her desk, breathing the air she had just vacated, holding the rubber stamp she used 100 times a day, and calmly, methodically, closed out the transaction. Why? The question roared in his mind, drowning out the hum of the fluorescent lights. Why bother stamping the book returned? If you have just abducted the librarian, why take the time to process a return? Thorne stood up, his knees popping, and began to pace the narrow aisle between the document boxes. He needed to think like the predator, not the investigator. He closed his eyes, visualizing the library layout as it was in 1984. The circulation desk was a fortress of oak in the center of the room. To leave, one had to pass it. If the perpetrator had entered just as Elena was closing, control. The word surfaced in his mind. It was an act of supreme control. It wasn't just about hiding the crime, it was about assuming the role. It was a moment of possession. The killer hadn't just wanted Elena, he wanted her life, her routine, her space. By stamping that book, he was declaring that he was in charge of the narrative. Or, perhaps more pragmatically, he was buying time. If a patron walked in at 8:56 p.m., seeing someone behind the desk, anyone, would prevent an alarm from being raised. The librarian is busy, they might think. That's a new volunteer. Thorne stopped pacing and returned to the table. He needed to know who had borrowed The Hunt for Red October. He traced the line back to the checkout column. September 30th, 1984. Borrower, Arthur Halloway. Thorne knew the name. Halloway was a high school history teacher, retired now, likely in his late 70s if he was still alive. Thorne pulled the Witness Interviews H file from the 1984 box. The paper was yellowed, the typewritten text fading to a ghostly grey. He found the interview summary. It was painfully brief. Date, October 16th, 1984. Interviewing officer, Sergeant Miller. Subject, Arthur Halloway. Statement. Subject stated he was home on the evening of October 14th. Confirmed he was a patron of the library, but had not been there on the night in question. Stated he returned his books a few days prior via the outdoor drop box. Via the drop box, Thorne whispered, his voice raspy. If Halloway had used the drop box, the books would have been collected the next morning by Elena or her assistant and backdated to the previous day if necessary, or stamped with the current date. But the log showed a specific time, 8:55 p.m. Returns from the Dropbox weren't logged with specific timestamps like that. They were batch processed in the morning. A specific time meant a face-to-face transaction. Miller had missed it. Thorne had missed it. They had accepted Halloway's statement because Halloway was a pillar of the community, a boring academic with thick glasses and a stammer, and because the investigation had pivoted so quickly to the tire tracks in the parking lot and the ex-boyfriend with the temper. Thorne looked at the clock on the wall. 3:17 a.m. He couldn't go knock on Halloway's door now, not without a warrant, and certainly not as a retired detective digging through cold files in the middle of the night, but he couldn't go home either. The apartment he lived in alone, since Sarah had left, unable to compete with the ghosts of his cases, was too quiet. He poured the cold remnants of a pot of coffee into his mug and sat back down. He needed to be sure. He needed to see the physical book. The library kept records, but they also kept the books until they fell apart. The Hunt for Red October had been a bestseller, hardcover, durable. Unless it had been lost or weeded out of the collection, it might still be on the shelf. And if it was the same copy from 1984? Thorne felt a flicker of the old adrenaline, the electric current that used to drive him through double shifts and sleepless weeks. The checkout cards. In 1984, the library used the old system, a card in a pocket, glued to the back of the book. The borrower signed their name, and the librarian stamped the due date. When the book was returned, the card was put back in the pocket. If the system had been modernized to barcodes, the old card might still be there, tucked away as a relic, or the pocket might have been ripped out. But if the card was there, it would have Halloway's signature, and next to it, the due date stamp. But the logbook was the master record. The discrepancy between the Dropbox story and the 8:55 p.m. timestamp was the key. Thorne spent the next 4 hours dissecting the _20_ initials. He pulled every other file from the precinct that involved anyone with those initials. Michael Thomas, a petty thief. Martin Tiller, a drunk driver. Mary Tolliver, a fraudster. None fit. The handwriting didn't match. The jagged M of the logbook was distinctive. The midpoint of the M didn't touch the baseline. It hovered in the middle, like a suspended bridge. As dawn broke, painting the precinct windows in shades of bruised purple and grey, Thorne washed his face in the men's room. The mirror showed a man he barely recognized. Eyes sunken, stubble grey and patchy, skin possessing the pallor of old parchment. He straightened his tie, put on his trench coat, and walked out into the cool morning air. The Oakhaven Public Library was a brick building that had seen better days. Vines that had once been charming were now overgrown, choking the windows. Thorne parked his sedan in the same spot where he had parked it on October 15th, 1984, the morning the call came in. He sat for a moment, watching the wind push dry leaves across the asphalt. This was where Elena's car had been found, unlocked, purse on the passenger seat. He got out and walked to the entrance. The library didn't open until 9 a.m. It was 7:45. He walked around the perimeter. The drop box was still there, a metal chute embedded in the brick wall. He ran his hand over the cold metal. If Halloway had put the book in here, it would have fallen into a bin inside. Thorne waited. At 8:30, a woman unlocked the side door. It was Mrs. Gable, the current head librarian. She had been a junior assistant in '84, hired 2 months after Elena vanished to fill the void. Thorne approached her as she struggled with a ring of keys. "Detective Thorne," she said, surprise widening her eyes behind her bifocals. She clutched her purse tighter. Everyone in town knew Thorne couldn't let it go. To some, he was a tragic hero. To others, a nuisance who wouldn't let the town forget its darkest night. "Mrs. Gable, good morning. I apologize for the early hour. Has something happened? Is it about Elena?" "Just tidying up some loose ends before I fully step down," Thorne lied smoothly. His voice was gravel, but steady. "I need to check a book, a specific volume." She hesitated, then sighed, her shoulders dropping. "Come in, Marcus. I was just putting the coffee on." The library smelled the same, old paper, floor wax and dust. It was a smell that usually brought Thorne comfort, but today it smelled like a tomb. He followed Mrs. Gable past the circulation desk, the desk where MT had stood. He forced himself not to look at the spot where the logbook used to sit. They had computers now, beige boxes with blinking green cursors. "What book are you looking for?" Mrs. Gable asked, moving behind the counter. "Clancy, The Hunt for Red October, the hardcover edition, specifically a copy that would have been in circulation in 1984. Mrs. Gable typed onto her keyboard. The clacking sound was jarringly loud. "We have 3 copies. 2 are paperbacks bought in the 90s, 1 hardcover. Yes. Accession number 84-0922. It's still in the system. Status, on shelf." Thorne felt his heart hammer against his ribs. "Where?" "Fiction, Section C. It's rarely checked out these days. Too heavy to carry to the beach, I suppose." Thorne moved to the stacks. He knew exactly where the C's were. He walked down the aisle, his fingers trailing over the spines. Crichton, Christie, Clancy. There it was. The red lettering on the spine was faded to pink. The edges of the hardcover were frayed, the cardboard showing through the cloth. Thorne pulled it off the shelf. It felt heavy, substantial. He opened the back cover. The library had switched to barcodes in the late '80s. A barcode sticker was plastered over the top half of the old paper pocket. But the pocket was still there, and inside, the pocket was empty. Thorne let out a breath he didn't know he was holding, a mixture of frustration and fury. Of course, they removed the filled cards. He turned to Mrs. Gable, who had followed him. She said gently. Thorne's grip on the book tightened until his knuckles turned white. He asked. Mrs. Gable adjusted her glasses. Thorne demanded, the intensity in his voice making Mrs. Gable take a step back. The basement was musty, lit by a single naked bulb that cast long, swinging shadows. Boxes were stacked floor to ceiling. Mrs. Gable pointed to a corner. Thorne spent the next 6 hours in the basement. He took off his trench coat, rolled up his sleeves and went to work. He found the system. Elena had organized them by year, then by title. He moved boxes, dust coating his throat, his hands turning grey with grime. 1982, 1983, 1984. He found the box for C.D. Authors, 1984. He flipped through the cards. Carrie, Christine, Cujo, The Hunt for Red October. He pulled the card out. It was a rectangle of thick orange cardstock, lined with columns. He scanned the signatures. There, on the 4th line from the bottom, Arthur Halloway. And next to it, in the date due column, the stamp, October 28th, 1984, the standard 2-week loan period. But it was the date returned column that mattered. The stamp was there, October 14th, and next to it, the initials. Thorne held the card under the bulb. The ink was faded, but the impression was deep. M.T. It matched the logbook, the same jagged M, the same slashing T. But there was something else, a smudge of reddish-brown on the corner of the card, partially obscuring the bottom of the T. Thorne squinted. It looked like rust, or chocolate, or dried blood. He carefully placed the card into an evidence bag he had pulled from his pocket. This was physical evidence. If that was blood, and if 1995 DNA technology could pull a profile from an 11-year-old sample, it was a long shot, but it was the only shot he had. But before the lab, he had a visit to make. Arthur Halloway lived in a bungalow on the south side of town, a neighborhood that had slowly deteriorated as the steel mill layoffs hit. The paint on the house was peeling, revealing grey wood underneath. Thorne walked up the path, noting the overgrown hedges. He knocked. It took a long time for the door to open. Arthur Halloway was a shadow of the man Thorne remembered. He was stooped, leaning heavily on a cane, his cardigan stained with food. He peered at Thorne through thick, cataract-clouded lenses. Halloway blinked. Halloway hesitated, his hand trembling on the doorframe. Halloway flinched. It was a small movement, a tightening of the jaw, but Thorne saw it. Halloway said, his voice rising in pitch, a defensive whine. Thorne held up the evidence bag with the card inside. Halloway stared at the card. His face went ashen. He backed away, leaving the door open. Thorne stepped inside. The house smelled of boiled cabbage and old medicine. Halloway whispered, collapsing into a worn armchair. Thorne said, standing over him. Halloway looked up, tears welling in his milky eyes. The air in the room seemed to freeze. Thorne felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Halloway stammered. Thorne commanded, pulling out his notebook. Halloway whispered. Thorne's hand gripped the pen so hard it threatened to snap. Halloway sobbed, burying his face in his hands. Thorne fought the urge to grab the old man by his collar. Disgust roiled in his gut, hot and acidic. But anger wouldn't solve the case. Information would. The initials, Thorne said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. He wrote MT. Do you know what that means? Halloway shook his head violently. No, I didn't see what he wrote until you showed me. I just saw him write. Think, Arthur. Did you see anything else? A car outside? A scar? A tattoo? Anything? Halloway wiped his nose on his sleeve. He looked up, his eyes searching the past. His hand, when he held the pen, He had a ring, a big, silver ring, heavy, on his pinky finger. What kind of ring? It had a symbol, not a school ring. It looked industrial, like a gear or a saw blade. Thorne's mind raced. A gear, a saw blade. Oakhaven was a mill town, or had been. The steel mill, the lumber yard, the auto plant. Thousands of men wore rings like that. But MT? Thorne left Halloway weeping in his chair. He had enough to push the investigation into a new phase. He drove back to the precinct, the image of the ring burning in his mind. When he arrived, he went straight to the evidence locker. He placed the library card in a secure drawer. Then he went to his desk and pulled out the phone book. He turned to the yellow pages. Industrial supplies, mechanics, unions. He paused. MT. Machine Technologies? No, that was a company that opened in '88. Millwright team? He needed a fresh pair of eyes. He picked up the phone and dialed the extension for Detective Sarah Mills. She was young, sharp, and the only person in the department who didn't look at Thorne like he was a dinosaur. "Mills," she answered. "It's Thorne. I need you in the records room, now." "Marcus, I thought you were packing up." "I unpacked. Get down here." When Mills arrived, Thorne laid it all out. The logbook, the discrepancy, the Halloway confession, the ring description. She listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from skepticism to intense focus. "So we have a ghost," Mills said, looking at the photocopy of the MT initials. "Someone who was comfortable enough to impersonate a librarian, while presumably holding her captive in the back office. That takes a special kind of psychopath. Organized, arrogant." "Or familiar," Thorne said. "He knew where the stamp was. He knew the procedure." "Or he just watched her," Mills countered, "stalked her, learned the routine." "The ring," Thorne said. "A gear or a saw blade, silver, pinky finger." Mills picked up the photocopy. MT. Could it be a nickname? Motor? Metal? "Or a location," Thorne said. "Look at the handwriting again. Look at the T. It's not just a cross. The top bar, it has serifs, downward-pointing serifs." Mills squinted. "It looks like an anvil." Thorne froze. An anvil. "The Ironworkers Union," Thorne said softly. "Local 402. Their logo is an anvil with a gear behind it." Mills nodded slowly. "And MT? Master Tradesman?" Thorne guessed. "Or maybe initials of a member." "If it's a union ring," Mills said, standing up, "we can find who made them. We can find a roster from 1984. "Get the roster," Thorne ordered. "Cross-reference every member with the initials MT and check for criminal records involving sexual assault or kidnapping." Mills was already moving toward the door. "On it." Thorne sat back. He felt a strange vibration in his chest. It wasn't hope. He had killed hope years ago to survive. But it was momentum. The gears of the case were turning again, grinding off the rust of 11 years. He looked at the photocopy of the library card one last time. The reddish-brown smudge. If that was blood, and if it belonged to the killer. He picked up the phone and dialed the state lab. He needed a favor. He needed a rush job on a sample that didn't officially exist on an active docket. He had 48 hours before his retirement party. 48 hours to turn a ghost into a man. The hours that followed were a blur of paperwork and phone calls. Thorne bullied the lab technician into accepting the sample, citing a potential link to a current serial cases in the tri-state area. A lie, but a necessary one. He drank 3 more pots of coffee. He ate nothing. At 8 p.m., Mills returned. She dropped a thick computer printout on his desk. "Local 402 membership, 1984, she said, looking exhausted but wired. "There were 400 members. I filtered for initials MT. Thorne pulled the stack toward him. "How many?" 6, Mills said. "Michael Trent, died 1986. Mark Twain, no joke, legal name. Moved to Florida in 85. Matthew Thorne, no relation, I checked. Clean record. Martin Tate, Mason Tolley, and Magnus Torvalds. Backgrounds? Tate was a welder. Clean. Tolly was a machinist. 1 DUI. Torvalds. Mills hesitated. Torvalds was a foreman, big guy, known for having a temper. He was let go in '85 for assaulting a co-worker. Put him in the hospital. Where is he now? Prison, Mills said. Corcoran, serving 20 to life. For what? Murder, Mills said grimly. 2nd degree, beating a prostitute to death in 1987. Thorne felt the world narrow down to a single point. 1987, 3 years after Elena. The MO was messy, Mills said, brute force. But here's the kicker. When they booked him, they catalogued his personal effects. 1 silver ring, pinky finger. Design, Ironworkers Local 402 emblem. Thorne stood up. He grabbed his coat. Get the car. Where are we going? Corcoran isn't a drive we can make tonight, Thorne said. We're going to his mother's house, or whoever is holding his storage. If he kept the library book checkout vibe going, maybe he kept other trophies. He's been inside for 8 years, Marcus. Anything he had is long gone. Not necessarily. Guys like this, they hide things where they think they're safe. Did he have family in Oakhaven? Mills checked her notes. A sister, Janice Torvalds, still lives on Elm Street. Let's go. The drive to Elm Street was silent. The rain had started, a cold, miserable drizzle that slicked the streets. Thorne watched the wipers slash back and forth. M.T. Magnus Torvalds. The handwriting on the logbook, jagged, sharp, like a man used to carving into metal. Janice Torvalds lived in a duplex that smelled of cat litter and stale smoke. She opened the door, a cigarette dangling from her lip. She looked tired, worn down by the weight of her brother's sins. She asked, eyeing their badges. Thorne said, she scoffed. The casualness of the question made Thorne's stomach turn. We're investigating a disappearance from 1984. Elena Vance. Janice's face changed. The cynicism vanished, replaced by a flicker of fear. The librarian girl? Did Magnus know her? Magnus read a lot, Janice said quietly. He was weird like that. Big brute, liked to break things, but he always had a book. Said it made him look smart. He went to that library all the time. Thorne stepped closer. Did he keep things? Boxes? Trunks? Janice hesitated. She looked at the rain falling behind them. There's a footlocker in the attic. I never opened it. It was heavy and I didn't want to know. I figured it was just his tools. Show us, Mills said softly. The attic was freezing. The rain drummed loudly on the roof. In the corner, under a tarp, sat a green military-style footlocker. A heavy padlock secured the latch. I don't have the key, Janice said from the bottom of the stairs. She refused to come up. Thorne didn't wait. He looked around, found a crowbar leaning against the wall, and jammed it into the hasp. With a grunt of exertion that sent a sharp pain through his shoulder, he wrenched it open. The metal screeched and snapped. Thorne threw the lid back. On top were old work clothes, overalls stained with grease, a pair of steel-toed boots. Thorne lifted the clothes. Underneath were books, dozens of them. The Day of the Jackal, The Bourne Identity, Gorky Park. Thorne picked one up. It was a library book. He opened the cover. Oakhaven Public Library. Stamped, discard? No, no stamp, just stolen. He dug deeper. At the bottom of the locker, wrapped in a greasy rag, was a small cardboard box. Thorne's hands trembled as he unwrapped it. He opened the box. Inside lay a pair of reading glasses, a delicate gold chain, and a name tag. Elena. Thorne closed his eyes. He let out a breath that felt like it had been trapped in his lungs for a decade. He heard Mills gasp behind him. Mills whispered. Thorne picked up the tag. It was plastic, mundane, cheap, but to him it was the holy grail. He turned it over. On the back, scratched into the plastic with a knife point, were the initials M.T. Thorne said, his voice void of emotion. Mills said. Thorne didn't smile. He stared at the name tag. We have the killer, but we don't have Elena. Maybe he'll talk now, Mills said. If we show him this, if we jam him up. Maybe, Thorne said. He placed the tag into an evidence bag. He stood up, his knees aching, his back stiff. He felt the weight of the years lifting, but the sadness remained, heavy and immutable. Let's book this, Thorne said. Then I need to make a phone call to the Vance family. They've waited long enough. As they walked out into the rain, Thorne looked at his watch. October 16th, 1995. 11 years and 2 days. He got into the car. He looked at the library checkout log photocopy still sitting on the dashboard. The jagged asterisk, MT asterisk, seemed less like a mystery now and more like a tombstone engraving. You know, Thorne said as Mills started the engine, I was going to retire on Friday. I know, Mills said, glancing at him. Are you still? Thorne looked out the window at the town passing by, the town that had hidden a monster in plain sight, the town that had forgotten Elena Vance. I have to interrogate Torvalds, Thorne said. I have to find where he put her. I have to bring her home. So, Monday then? Mills smiled faintly. Yeah, Thorne said, allowing himself a small, grim smile. Monday. He touched the pocket of his coat where the evidence bag sat. The chain of custody was unbroken. The circle was closing. The mystery of the returned book was solved. It wasn't an act of conscience. It was an act of ownership. Torvalds had returned the book because, in his twisted mind, he was the master of the library for those 5 minutes. He had taken Elena, and he had taken her place. Thorne closed his eyes and finally, for the first time in 11 years, he slept. The car hummed beneath him, driving through the rain, carrying him toward the end of the story. Marcus Thorne slammed the clear plastic evidence bag onto the metal interrogation table. The sound cracked through the stale air of the interview room, causing the man in the orange jumpsuit to blink just once. Inside the bag, the laminated name tag caught the harsh overhead fluorescent light. Elena Vance, head librarian, Thorne said. He leaned in, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the table. Arthur Torvalds didn't look at the bag. He looked at a spot on the wall just past Thorne's left ear. He sat with the stillness of a statue, his hands folded politely in his lap, the cuffs clinking softly against each other. I found it, Torvalds said. His voice was dry like shifting gravel. You found it, Detective Mills repeated from the corner, his arms crossed. In the library? On the floor? On the grass, Torvalds said. Outside. I took it home for safekeeping. I intended to return it. For 11 years? Thorne asked. You returned a library book 11 years late, Arthur. But you kept the name tag. Why? Torvalds shrugged. It was a small, dismissive motion. I forgot I had it. Thorne pulled out the second evidence bag, the library checkout card. He slid it across the table until it rested directly over Torvalds' reflected face in the polished steel. Torvalds finally looked at Thorne. His eyes were pale, watery, and utterly devoid of fear. Thorne listed, his voice rising. Torvalds corrected softly. He leaned forward, the chain between his wrists rattling against the table edge. Thorne felt a vein in his temple pulse. The arrogance was a wall, smooth and unclimbable. Torvalds knew the law better than some lawyers. Without Elena, without forensic proof of death, this was kidnapping at best, theft at worst. Thorne whispered. Torvalds smiled. It was a thin, tight expression. Thorne stared at him for a long 10 seconds. He memorized the topography of the man's face, the pores, the stubble, the dead eyes. He knew with a sinking, nauseating certainty that Torvalds would never speak. The interrogation was over. They would charge him with kidnapping, tampering with evidence, and theft. They would put him away for 10, maybe 15 years if the judge was harsh. But they wouldn't get a murder conviction. Not today. Thorne grabbed the evidence bags and walked out. He didn't slam the door. He closed it with a terrifying gentleness. The precinct hummed with the noise of a new era. Typewriters were being replaced by beige computer towers that took up half the desk space. The air smelled of ozone and hot plastic. Thorne stood at his desk, a cardboard box in his hands. He was 62 years old. His badge was already on the captain's desk. Mills said. Mills was sitting at the adjacent desk, watching him. Thorne said. Thorne snapped. He softened his tone immediately, looking down at the box. Inside was the file, a duplicate he had spent the last week photocopying on the precinct's temperamental Xerox machine. Every witness statement, every map, every forensic report from 1984. Torvalds is eligible for parole in 2008, Thorne said. If he gets out, and we haven't found her, he wins.
He's in state until then, Mills said. We got him on the kidnapping charge. It was a miracle we got that much.
It wasn't enough. Thorne picked up the box. It felt heavier than paper should. It felt like a person. He walked out of the precinct into the bright spring sunlight. He didn't look back at the building that had housed his career for 30 years. He placed the box on the passenger seat of his sedan, strapped the seatbelt around it, and drove home. The 1984 investigation was now officially, quote, 192, quote. But in the trunk of his car, Thorne carried a shovel. He always carried a shovel, just in case. The digitization project began on a Tuesday. The directive came from the state capital. All felony case files dating back to 1980 were to be scanned and uploaded to the new National Criminal Information Center database. Inside the basement records room, a young clerk named Sarah fed pages into a flatbed scanner. The machine whirred and groaned, a rhythmic mechanical breath. Thorne, now 3 years retired, stood in the doorway. He had called in a favor to be allowed down here. He wasn't technically allowed to handle the evidence anymore, but nobody had the heart to stop him. "Be careful with those," Thorne said. Sarah jumped, nearly dropping a sheaf of yellowed papers. "Jesus, detective, you scared me." "Sorry," Thorne said. He stepped into the room. "That paper is brittle. The humidity down here in the late 80s was terrible." "I'm being careful," Sarah said. She placed a document on the glass. It was the original topographical map of the search grid from November 1984. The red marker circles where the dogs had alerted were fading to pink. Thorne watched as the scanner light swept across the map. In that bright white line, the physical reality of the search was being converted into pixels, zeros and ones. It felt sterile. It felt like the case was being embalmed. "What happens to the physical files after you scan them?" Thorne asked. "They go to long-term storage in the warehouse district," Sarah said. "Deep freeze, basically. Unless a detective requests them, they'll probably never be opened again." Thorne watched the monitor.
The math appeared on the screen, crisp and bright. The fading red ink looked fresh again in the digital glow.
"Make sure you scan the backs of the photos," Thorne said. "We wrote notes on them. Dates, times, weather conditions." "I know the procedure, detective," Sarah said gently. She reached for the next item. It was a small envelope containing the soil samples collected from the tires of Elena's car. The envelope was sealed with red tape. 204, Thorne said. Sarah paused. 205, 206, Sarah 7, Sarah said. 208, Thorne said. He walked over and picked up the envelope. He could feel the grit inside through the paper. 209. Sarah looked at him, then at the envelope. She sighed and typed a note into her computer. Item 404-B, soil samples, retained for lab review. 210, Thorne said. He handed the envelope back. For a moment, he didn't let go. He was holding on to 1984. Then he released his grip. Science was catching up. That was the promise the newsletters made. Thorne sat in the waiting room of the State Forensics Laboratory. He was older now, his hair completely white, a cane resting against his knee. He wasn't a cop anymore, but the lead geneticist, Dr. Aris Thorne, was family. His niece, Aris, walked through the double doors. She was 30 years old, sharp-featured, wearing a white lab coat that seemed too big for her shoulders. She held a clipboard. She didn't look happy. "Uncle Marcus," she said. Thorne stood up, leaning heavily on the cane. "You ran it?" "We ran it," Aris said. She guided him to a plastic chair in the corner of the hallway, away from the reception desk. "We used the new short tandem repeat method. It's sensitive, much better than what they had in the 90s. And? We pulled a profile from the hairbrush, Aris said. It matches the reference sample from Elena's mother. It's definitely Elena's hair. Thorne nodded, impatient. I know it's her hair, Aris. We took it from her bathroom. What about the other sample? The fibers from the trunk of Torvald's car? Aris looked down at the clipboard. It's inconclusive, Marcus. Thorne felt the air leave his lungs. How? You said the new method works with degraded samples. It does, Aris explained, her voice clinical but soft. But the sample from the trunk, it was contaminated. Cleaning chemicals. Torvalds must have scrubbed that trunk with industrial bleach before you impounded it in '84. The DNA is shredded. We got a partial markers, but not enough for a court match. The probability ratio is 1 in 400. A defense attorney would tear that apart. 1 in 400, Thorne muttered. In a town of 2,000 people. It's not enough, Aris said. I'm sorry, we can't place her in the car with genetics. Thorne looked at the floor. The tiles were speckled grey and white. What about the mitochondrial DNA, the shaft of the hair? Same issue, Aris said. The bleach destroyed the cellular structure. We're looking at chemical ghosts, Marcus. We can see something was there, but we can't prove who it was. Thorne nodded slowly. He took the clipboard from her, staring at the jagged graphs of the DNA readout. Peaks and valleys, a landscape of failure. Keep the samples, Thorne said. Don't destroy them. We won't, Aris promised. Technology moves fast. Maybe in 10 years. Touch DNA, or something we haven't invented yet. 10 years, Thorne said. Torvalds gets out in 4. The phone rang at 3 a.m. Thorne was awake instantly.
He didn't sleep much these days, he rasped.
The voice said. Mills sounded winded. Thorne sat up, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. Mills said. Thorne was dressed in 3 minutes. The drive was a blur of rain and headlights. Thorne's mind raced. East. Why east? Had he been wrong about the hunting grounds? Had Torvalds doubled back? When he arrived, the site was lit by portable floodlights that turned the mud into a stark, lunar landscape. Yellow tape fluttered in the wind. A mud-slicked pit gaped in the center of the construction zone. Thorne ducked under the tape. A state trooper tried to stop him, but Mills intervened,
waving him through.
Mills said. They stood at the edge of the pit. A forensic anthropologist was brushing dirt away from a ribcage. Thorne stared. He looked at the bones. He looked at the scraps of blue fabric clinging to the hip bone. It was blue wool, just like the library catalogue description. Thorne felt a strange sensation in his chest. Hope? Dread? Finality? Mills whispered. Thorne slid down the muddy bank, his boots sinking into the clay. He crouched next to the anthropologist. Thorne said. The anthropologist shone a light into the skull's jaw. We haven't cleaned them yet. She had a gold crown, Thorne said. Lower right molar, put in when she was 16. The anthropologist adjusted the angle of the light. Thorne leaned in, his face inches from the skull. He peered into the shadowed jawbone. White enamel, amalgam fillings, no gold. Thorne stared for a long time. He looked at the fabric again. It was denim, not wool. The mud had disguised the texture. It's not her, Thorne said. His voice was flat. Marcus, we need to wait for dental records to be sure, Mills said from the rim of the pit. It's not her. Thorne stood up, his knees cracking. Elena had a gold crown. This girl doesn't. And this is denim. Elena hated denim. She said it was unprofessional for a librarian. He climbed out of the pit. The rain was falling harder now, washing the mud from his boots. Who is it then? Mills asked. Someone else's daughter, Thorne said. Someone else's cold case. He walked back to his car. The false hope was worse than the silence. It was a cruel trick of the universe. He sat in the driver's seat and watched the rain streak the windshield. He felt old, truly old. The cold case unit was officially formed in a renovated storage room on the second floor of the precinct. It consisted of 2 desks, a new computer, and a coffee machine that leaked. Detective Sarah Jenkins, The former records clerk who had scanned the files 7 years ago was now a detective. She had requested the assignment. She sat across from Thorne. He was visiting, bringing donuts, a ritual he maintained every Tuesday. Jenkins said. She tapped a thick binder. Thorne took a bite of a glazed donut. Jenkins opened the binder. She spun the binder around. A map of the county was covered in coloured dots. Jenkins traced a circle with her finger. Thorne said. Jenkins corrected. She pointed to a wedge of land southwest of the town. Thorne put down the donut. He put on his glasses. Jenkins said. Thorne stared at the map. The quarry, deep water, rock piles. Thorne said, remembering the interrogation. Jenkins said. Thorne said. Jenkins said. Thorne finished. Jenkins said. Thorne felt a chill. Jenkins said. Thorne tested the word. Thorne leaned back. The technology was moving beyond him. He was an analog man in a laser world. But the instinct was the same. Thorne said. Torvalds was released. He walked out of the state correctional facility at 10 a.m. He was 68 years old, thinner, greyer, but his eyes were the same. Thorne sat in his car in the parking lot across the street. He watched Torvalds get into a taxi. Thorne started his engine. He wasn't a cop. He couldn't arrest him, but he could watch. He followed the taxi for an hour. It drove to a halfway house in the city. Torvalds got out carrying a single duffel bag. He didn't look around. He walked inside. Thorne parked down the block. He sat there for 4 hours. His cell phone rang. It was Aris. Uncle Marcus? I'm here, Thorne said. Where is here? Watching him. There was a pause on the line. Marcus, you can't do that. It's harassment. If he sees you, he'll file a restraining order, and it will hurt the case. He killed her, Aris. We know. But staring at his halfway house won't find her. Science will find her. Science is too slow, Thorne snapped. I have news, Aris said. Her voice changed. It became the voice of Dr. Thorne, not the niece. I'm taking over the lab's cold case forensic unit. I'm officially the lead on the Vance case. Thorne watched the front door of the halfway house. You're just a kid. I have a PhD, Marcus, and I have a grant. We're going to reprocess everything, not just the DNA, everything. The soil, the clothes, the car mats. We have new mass spectrometry equipment. We can identify pollen grains and mineral isotopes now. Thorne griped the steering wheel. Isotopes. Geological fingerprints, Aris said. If there was dirt on Torvald's shovel or on his shoes, we can tell exactly where that dirt came from, down to the square mile. Thorne looked at the halfway house one last time. He put the car in drive. Okay, Thorne said. Do it. I'm coming to the lab. The evidence audit took 3 years. The backlog in the state system was a nightmare, and Aris had to fight for every hour of machine time. Marcus Thorne sat in the lab's observation room. He was 79. His hands shook slightly now, a tremor he hid by clasping them together. On the other side of the glass, Aris and a technician were working with the samples Thorne had saved from the digitization clerk in 2001. The soil from Elena's tires, and the soil from a pair of boots found in Torvald's garage, boots he claimed he hadn't worn in years. Aris walked out of the sealed room, stripping off her latex gloves. She held a printout. She didn't smile. Her face was pale, focused, intense. Marcus, she said. She sat down next to him. Tell me, Thorne said. We analyzed the soil from the boots, Aris said. Torvald said he hadn't worn them since 1983, but the pollen analysis shows ragweed and goldenrod from the fall of 1984. He was lying. We knew he was lying, Thorne said. Does it tell us where? Aris laid the printout on the table. It was a graph, showing spikes of different elements. Look at this peak. She pointed to a sharp spike in the line. Strontium and, wait for it, traces of pulverized limestone with a high concentration of quartz. The quarry, Thorne whispered. Jenkins had been right. Not just the quarry, Aris said. It's specific. We found traces of a mineral called illite. It's a clay mineral, but in this county, Illite is only found in deep subsurface layers. It's not on the surface. Thorne looked at her, trying to understand. So he dug a deep hole. No, Aris said. The only place you find illite on the surface is where deep earth has been brought up artificially, like a mining operation. She pulled out a second sheet. It was a geological map of the quarry. But here's the key, Marcus. We found traces of ammonium nitrate in the soil sample. Fertilizer? Explosives, Aris corrected. Blasting residue. The dirt on his boots came from a fresh blast zone. She tapped a specific coordinate on the map.
In October 1984, the quarry was blasting in Sector 4. They blew the rock face, moved the debris, and created a temporary spoil heap. That heap sat there for 2 weeks before they graded it over for a service road. Aris looked up, her eyes locking with Thorne's. Thorne stared at the map. Sector 4, a service road. Thorne said. His voice broke. Aris said. Thorne closed his eyes. He saw the rain in 1984. He saw the empty library. He saw the name tag. Thorne said, standing up. He didn't need the cane. Get the excavators. We're going to dig up the road. The machine in the other room beeped, a steady, rhythmic confirmation of the truth that had been waiting in the dirt for 31 years. The soil had never forgotten, and now, finally, it had spoken. The hum of the mass spectrometer fan was the only sound that dared to compete with the weight of the silence settling over the room.
Thorne stood there, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the stainless steel table, the vibration of the machine traveling up through his arms, grounding him in the here and now, pulling him away from the memory of the rain-slicked streets of 1984. Marcus, Aris said softly. She hadn't moved. Her finger was still resting on the topographical map, pinning down the ghost of a crime that had haunted the department for 3 decades. Thorne took a breath, the air in the lab tasting of ozone and sterile cleaners. He murmured, the words scraping against his throat. Thorne pushed off the table, the phantom pain in his bad leg, flaring briefly before being swallowed by the adrenaline surging through his system. Aris said, her voice regaining its clinical edge, though her eyes remained soft. Thorne turned to the door. Aris asked, already reaching for the phone. Thorne said, grabbing his trench coat from the rack. Thorne buttoned the coat, his movements sharp and precise. The drive to the courthouse was a blur of grey sky and wet asphalt. Thorne drove with the radio off, the silence inside the sedan thick with the presence of the girl who wasn't there. Elena. Her name was Elena, but in his head she had simply become the case for so long that reclaiming her name felt like the first step in the excavation. He remembered the photos in the file, the school portrait with the awkward bangs, the candid shot of her laughing at a picnic. She was 16. She had been wearing a blue windbreaker and a name tag from her after-school job at the pharmacy. She's under the road. The thought cycled through his mind like a mantra. Sector 4, under the road. When Thorne arrived at the courthouse, the sky had bruised into a deep purple, threatening a storm that mirrored the turbulence in his gut. He bypassed the security line with a flash of his badge and a look that told the guards this wasn't the day to ask for paperwork. Judge Halloway's chambers smelled of old paper and mahogany. The judge was older now, his hair thinned to white wisps, but his eyes were still sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. He listened to Thorne without interrupting, his fingers steepled under his chin. "You're asking me to authorize the destruction of a private service road in an active quarry," Halloway said slowly, his voice gravelly. "Based on pollen and clay found on a pair of boots 3 decades after the fact." "Not just clay, Arthur," Thorne said, using the man's first name, a breach of protocol that signaled the gravity of the moment. "Illite, deep earth minerals found on the surface. Blasting residue matches from the specific week she disappeared. The science isn't guessing, it's pointing." Halloway looked at the affidavit Thorne had slammed onto the desk. "Torvalds. I always hated that son of a bitch's smile. We just couldn't pin him to the timeline." "We have the timeline now," Thorne said, leaning forward. "We know where he was. We know what he was standing in, and we know what he buried." Halloway picked up his pen. The nib hovered over the paper for a second, trembling slightly, not from age, but from the weight of the decision. If you dig up that road and find nothing, Marcus, the county will have your badge. The quarry owners will sue us into the Stone Age. You know that. I don't need the badge anymore, Thorne said, his voice flat. I need her. Halloway signed. The scratch of the pen against the paper sounded like a lock tumbling open. The convoy arrived at the quarry gates, just as the last of the daylight was bleeding out of the sky. It was a parade of flashing lights, police cruisers, unmarked SUVs, and the lumbering, yellow shapes of two massive excavators brought in on flatbeds. The quarry was a scar on the landscape, a vast, terraced amphitheatre of grey stone and shadow.
The air here was colder, carrying the metallic tang of crushed rock and diesel. Thorne stepped out of his car, the wind whipping his coat around his legs. He leaned heavily on his cane for a moment, surveying the expanse. It was massive. Without the coordinates Aris had provided, looking for a body here would have been like looking for a specific grain of sand on a beach. Jenkins was already there, organizing the perimeter. He was a younger man, broad-shouldered and eager, but his face was grim as he approached Thorne. "We've locked down the main entrance and the south access," Jenkins reported. "Forensics is setting up the tent. The dig team is reviewing the geological survey." "Where is it?" Thorne asked. Jenkins pointed toward a ridgeline on the far side of the pit. A narrow, gravel-packed service road wound its way up the side of the excavation, used by dump trucks to haul debris. "Sector 4, that stretch right there between the two drainage culverts. It's been graded over and repaved at least twice since the 80s. "Get the lights up," Thorne ordered. "I want that road as bright as noon." Within 20 minutes, portable generator-powered floodlights snapped on, bathing the desolate stretch of road in a harsh, artificial white glare. The shadows of the rocks stretched out long and distorted, like grasping fingers. Aris arrived in the mobile command van. She stepped out wearing a white Tyvek suit, clutching a tablet. She walked over to where Thorne stood at the edge of the designated kill box. "We have to be surgical," she said, raising her voice over the rumble of the idling excavators. "If we just rip it up, we risk damaging remains. We need to strip the asphalt, then the subbase, then go layer by layer through the spoil." Thorne nodded to the operator of the lead excavator. "Do it." The first strike of the bucket against the asphalt was a jarring crunch that echoed off the quarry walls. The machine roared, its hydraulic arm flexing as it tore up a chunk of the road surface. It was violent work, loud and destructive, a stark contrast to the silence of the grave they were seeking. Hour after hour the work continued. The excavators peeled back the skin of the road, revealing the compacted gravel beneath. Then the gravel was scraped away, exposing the dark, heavy earth of the fill. Thorne didn't sit. He stood by the caution tape, watching every bucket load. His leg throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, but he ignored it. He watched the dirt fall. He watched the color of the soil change. Around 2 a.m., the rain started. It wasn't a downpour, but a cold, miserable drizzle that turned the dust to mud and slicked the visors of the forensic team. "Stop!" Aris shouted suddenly, her voice cutting through the mechanical din. The excavator operator froze the controls. The bucket hovered mid-air, dripping mud. Aris scrambled down into the shallow trench, followed by 2 other technicians. She knelt in the muck, pointing a flashlight at the wall of the cut. Thorne ducked under the tape and slid down the embankment to join her, his boots sinking into the wet clay. "What is it?" Thorne asked. "Look at the striation," Aris said, tracing a line in the dirt with a trowel. "See this layer of grey clay? That's the illite. That's the deep earth fill. We're in the blast debris from 84. "So we're close," Thorne said. "We're in the right time period," Aris confirmed. "Everything below this line is pre-1984. Everything above is later fill. If she's here, she's in this layer, about 2 feet thick." "Hand tools," Thorne commanded, looking up at Jenkins. "Kill the engines. We dig the rest by hand." The silence that followed the shutdown of the excavators was heavy. The only sounds were the hum of the generators, the patter of rain, and the wet shuck-shuck of shovels entering the earth. Thorne grabbed a spade. "Marcus, you don't have to," Jenkins started. "Grab a shovel, Jenkins," Thorne snapped. He drove the blade into the grey clay. It was heavy,
dense, sticky material. It fought them. It wanted to hold on to its secrets. They formed a line, 10 of them, working shoulder to shoulder in the trench. It was back-breaking work. The clay clung to the metal, weighing pounds with every lift. Thorne's breath came in ragged bursts. His coat was discarded, his shirt soaked with sweat and rain.
He wasn't a detective anymore. He was a grave robber, a man trying to undo time with brute force. He thought of Torvalds. He thought of the man's smug face in the interrogation room 3 days ago. "You got nothing on me, old man. Just fairy tales." "I'm coming for you," Thorne thought, tossing a shovel-load of grey mud onto the pile. "I'm digging up your sins." An hour passed, then 2. The trench was widening, deepening. A technician named Miller said from the far end of the line. Every movement stopped. The air seemed to be sucked out of the quarry. Thorne moved toward Miller, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Miller was on his knees, scraping away the clay with a small trowel. Aris was there in a second, pushing Miller aside gently. She lay flat on her stomach in the mud, her face inches from the ground. She worked the trowel with the precision of a surgeon, flicking away tiny clods of earth. Thorne shined his flashlight into the hole. Something blue. A patch of blue nylon, preserved by the anaerobic environment of the compacted clay. It was bright, shockingly so, against the drab grey of the earth. Aris whispered. Her voice trembled. Thorne felt the world tilt. Aris widened the hole. The shape of a shoulder emerged. Then the collar. The fabric was stained and compressed, but it was unmistakably a garment. Aris yelled, not looking up. The camera flashes popped like lightning, illuminating the gruesome discovery in staccato bursts. Thorne watched as Aris continued to clear the dirt. She moved down from the collar. And there it was, pinned to the fabric, encased in dirt but still legible through the plastic cover. A simple, rectangular name tag. The pin was rusted, but the white plastic had survived. Thorne fell to his knees. He didn't feel the impact. He stared at the name. The letters were black, blocky, mundane. Just a name tag. Just a piece of plastic she'd probably hated wearing because it snagged her sweaters. But now, it was the loudest thing on earth. "It's her," Thorne choked out. "It's Elena." Jenkins took off his cap and pressed it to his chest. The other officers stood in respectful silence, the rain washing over them. Aris sat back on her heels, wiping a mixture of rain and tears from her face. She looked up at Thorne. "We found her, Marcus. She's not alone anymore." Thorne reached out, his hand hovering over the blue nylon, trembling. He didn't touch it, couldn't touch it, that was for the coroner. But he needed to be close. He needed to apologize. "I'm sorry it took so long. I'm sorry you were cold." He slowly stood up, the mud clinging to his trousers. The pain in his leg was gone, replaced by a profound, hollowing exhaustion. He pulled his phone from his pocket. His wet fingers slipped on the screen as he dialed. "This is dispatch," the voice on the other end crackled. "This is Detective Thorne," he said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, hollow, ancient. "Code 187. We have a body at the quarry. Positive ID pending, but it's a match for case file 84-092. He paused, looking down at the blue fabric emerging from the grey clay. "Notify the DA," Thorne said, "and send a unit to pick up Torvalds. Charge him with murder in the first degree. Tell him—" Thorne's jaw tightened. "Tell him the dirt talked." The extraction took another 6 hours. By the time the coroner's van rolled away, the sun was rising over the rim of the quarry. The light was pale and watery, washing out the harsh shadows of the night. Thorne sat on the tailgate of the ambulance, a thermal blanket draped over his shoulders. He held a styrofoam cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Aris walked over, stripping off her Tyvek suit and tossing it into a biohazard bin. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, her hair matted with rain. She sat next to him on the tailgate. "You did it," she said quietly. "Science did it," Thorne corrected. "You did it." "We did it," Aris insisted. She took a sip from her own cup. "Torvalds is in custody. They picked him up at his house. Apparently, he was packing a bag."
He knew, Thorne said. The moment he saw the excavators on the news, or heard the rumble, he knew. They sat in silence for a while, watching the police tape flutter in the morning breeze. The hole in the road was a gaping wound, ugly and raw, but it was also clean. The poison had been drawn out. "What happens now?" Aris asked. "For you, I mean. You said you didn't need the badge." Thorne looked at the cane leaning against the bumper. He looked at his hands, still stained with the grey clay of Sector 4. "I have to go tell her mother," Thorne said. "She's in a nursing home in Cedar Creek. She has dementia. Some days she remembers, some days she doesn't." "Will you tell her anyway?" "Yes," Thorne said, "even if she forgets it 5 minutes later. She deserves to know that someone came for her daughter." He poured the cold coffee onto the ground. "And after that?" Aris pressed. Thorne stood up. He picked up the cane. The weight of it felt familiar again, a necessary support. "After that," Thorne said, looking toward the exit of the quarry, where the road led back to the world of the living. "I think I'm going to sleep for a week." He started walking toward his car. He stopped after a few paces and turned back to Aris. "Aris." She looked up. "Thank you." She nodded, a small, tired smile touching her lips. "Go home, Marcus." Thorne got into the sedan. He didn't look back at the hole in the road. The ghost was gone. Elena wasn't in the passenger seat anymore. She wasn't in the rearview mirror. She was where she belonged, found, named, and heading home. He turned the key. The engine purred to life. As he drove up the winding access road, ascending from the pit of the quarry, the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting a brilliant, blinding light across the windshield. Thorne lowered the visor, squinted against the glare, and drove back into the city that had forgotten, armed with the truth that never had. The radio crackled with the morning news, banal and cheerful, traffic reports and weather updates. Thorne reached out and turned it off. He preferred the quiet. It didn't feel heavy anymore. It just felt like peace. The seal on box 414 broke with a dry snap. Plastic gave way to steel scissors, falling in a curled ribbon onto the metal examination table. Dr. Aris Thorne did not look up at the sound. Her gloved hands moved with practiced economy, folding back the cardboard flaps that had remained closed for 8 years. Marcus Thorne stood 3 feet away. He leaned against the grey wall of the cold case unit, his arms crossed over his chest. He watched the box. It was a standard-issue banker's box, white cardboard yellowing at the corners, labelled in black marker. Vance, E, 1984, physical. The humidity logs suggest the basement storage was compromised in 2011, Aris said. She reached inside and withdrew a manila envelope. "But these seals are intact." "I checked them myself after the flood," Marcus said. His voice was low, a rumble that seemed to vibrate in the sterile room. Nothing got wet. Aris placed the envelope on the table. She picked up a scalpel. This was the turning point, the moment the timeline shifted from storage to active analysis. It was November 14th, 2016. The state police had authorized a systematic audit of all cold case evidence predating 1990, driven by new federal grant money allocated for genetic genealogy. Aris sliced the envelope open. She tilted it. A small glass vial slid out, followed by a plastic bag containing a dense, dark clump of earth. "Sample S44, Aris read from the label. "Collected October 12, 1984. Location, Cedar Creek Logging Road, mile marker 7. Marcus nodded. "Found in the wheel well of her abandoned car. We thought it was just mud from the road." "It was just mud in 1984, Aris corrected gently. She held the vial up to the fluorescent light. "Now, it is a geological fingerprint." This was the beginning of the end of the mystery. The audit was not merely a shuffling of papers, it was the application of a new lens to old data. The room was silent save for the hum of the air filtration system. "We have to catalogue everything before we send it to the lab," Aris said. She set the vial down. "We need to separate the biologicals from the geologicals."
She reached back into the box. She pulled out a smaller, clear evidence bag. Inside lay a hairbrush. It was a simple object, handle made of faux tortoise shell, bristles tangled with strands of pale hair. Mitochondrial source, Marcus said, taken from her bathroom. This is the key, Aris said, but the soil is the map. The investigation moved from the evidence room to the laboratory. The timeline advanced. The years between 2016 and 2023 were defined not by dramatic chases, but by the slow, grinding evolution of chemical analysis. In 1984, soil was dirt. It was categorized by color and texture. In 2023, soil was a composite of isotopes. Aris sat at her workstation at the University Forensics Department. The date was February 3, 2023. On her screen, a digital map of Oregon glowed in false color topography. She picked up the report from the mass spectrometer.
The machine had spent 48 hours breaking down the sample from the wheel well. It had vaporized the dirt, separating the strontium and oxygen atoms, measuring their weight. Marcus sat in the chair opposite her desk. He looked older now. The cane he used was no longer just a prop, it was a necessity. He watched Aris read the data. The 1992 sighting, Marcus said, staring at the map. The waitress in Idaho, she swore it was Elena. It wasn't, Aris said, her eyes scanning the columns of numbers. The isotope ratio in the soil from the car doesn't match Idaho. It doesn't match the sighting area. And the remains in 05? Marcus asked. The Jane Doe in Klamath County? Excluded 3 years ago, Aris reminded him. Dental records didn't align. But this, she tapped the paper, this is new. What does the dirt say?
Strontium 87 to strontium 86 ratios, Aris said. It tells us the age of the bedrock the soil came from. The soil in the wheel well didn't come from the library parking lot. It didn't come from her driveway. She typed a sequence of numbers into the mapping software. A filter applied itself to the map of Oregon. The screen turned mostly gray, masking out areas that did not match the chemical signature. It eliminates 90% of the state, Aris said. What's left? Volcanic substrates, Aris said. Specifically, distinct pockets of rhyolite near the Cascades. She zoomed in. The grey overlay vanished in 3 specific spots. 3 small islands of color remained on the map. Sector 1, the Obsidian Cliffs. Too far south, Aris muttered. Sector 2, the drainage basin near the highway. We searched that in '84. Sector 3. She paused. The third highlighted area was a narrow strip of land, rugged and dense with second-growth timber.
It was 10 miles north of where the car was found, but up a defunct logging grade that had been closed since the late 70s.
What is Sector 3? Marcus asked. It's a geological anomaly, Aris said. A quarry, abandoned. The soil there has a higher concentration of volcanic ash mixed with clay. It matches the sample in the wheel well perfectly. Marcus leaned forward. We never looked there. The road was washed out. We assumed her car couldn't make the climb. The car didn't, Aris said, but whoever took her did. The application of LiDAR technology marked the next phase. It was August 2023. The summer heat had dried the undergrowth, making the forests of Oregon brittle and brown. Aris stood in the bed of a pickup truck parked at the base of the access road. She held a tablet computer. Above them, a heavy-duty drone hovered, its rotors slicing the hot air with a distinct, angry buzz. Marcus sat in the cab of the truck, the air conditioning running. He watched through the windshield. Initiating scan, Aris said into her radio. The drone ascended. It carried a LiDAR unit, light detection and ranging. It fired hundreds of thousands of laser pulses per second at the ground below. The lasers hit the trees, the bushes, the rocks and the dirt, then bounced back to the sensor. On Aris's screen, the forest was being stripped away. The software filtered out the vegetation, the trees vanished, the bushes disappeared. All that remained was the naked earth, revealed in high-resolution relief. The drone flew a grid pattern over the quarry identified by the isotope data. Aris watched the digital terrain model build itself in real time.
She saw the old logging cuts. She saw the natural erosion of the creek beds. 4:53, she said. The drone banked, moving over the northern rim of the quarry. Aris said. She tapped the screen. She zoomed in. In the 1984 aerial photos, the quarry floor was flat. In the 2023 LiDAR scan, there was a discrepancy. Marcus asked through the open window. Aris said. She marked the coordinates, 44.8 degrees north, 122.3 degrees west. The anomaly was located near the tree line, shielded from the main road by a wall of granite. Marcus said. He opened the truck door and stepped out into the heat. The recovery process began 3 days later. It was not a frenzied event. There were no sirens, no yellow tape fluttering in the wind. It was a scientific excavation. The team consisted of Aris, 2 graduate assistants, and a crime scene technician from the state lab. Marcus stood at the perimeter. He was not allowed inside the grid. He understood the protocol. He was the historian. They were the surgeons. The site was staked out with string lines, dividing the ground into perfect square meters. The anomaly identified by the LiDAR was in grid C4. Aris worked on her knees. She used a flat-edged shovel to remove the top layer of humus. The decomposing leaves and needles accumulated over 40 years. 464, quote, she said. Her voice was calm, recorded by the camera mounted on a tripod. She switched to a trowel. The work slowed. They removed dirt in 5-centimeter increments. Every bucket of soil was passed to the assistants, who poured it through a wire mesh screen. They were looking for buttons, zippers, jewelry, anything synthetic. Marcus watched the sifting process. The sound of dirt hitting the metal screen was rhythmic. Shh, 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 shh. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky, casting long shadows into the quarry. Aris announced. She stopped digging. She used a brush to sweep away the loose dust. She said, pointing to the ground. The technician said. Aris said. She continued. The trowel scraped against something hard. It wasn't a rock. The sound was different, duller, hollower. Aris froze. She put the trowel down. She picked up a smaller brush and a wooden pick. Marcus took a step forward, his hand tightening on his cane. Stay back, Marcus, Aris said without looking up. She brushed away the dirt. A shape emerged. It was white, stained brown by the tannins in the soil. It was the curve of a bone. Proximal tibia, Aris said for the recorder. Human. She did not rush. She exposed the bone slowly, following its length. Next came the femur, then the pelvis. The body had been placed on its side. The clothing had disintegrated, leaving only the synthetic elastic of a waistband and the rubber soles of sneakers. Aris worked toward the skull. It was intact. She sat back on her heels and exhaled. She looked at the remains of Elena Vance. The librarian had been waiting in the dark for 40 years. Time of recovery, Aris said, checking her watch. 16:42 hours. September 14th, 2024. She looked at Marcus. He was weeping. He did not make a sound. The tears simply tracked down the deep lines of his face. He nodded once, a gesture of profound, exhausting relief. The final phase was the confirmation. Visual identification was impossible. Dental records were incomplete. The rural dentist Elena had used in the 70s had lost his files in a fire. The burden of proof rested on the molecular level. October 1st, 2024. The DNA laboratory. Aris stood in front of the sequencer. The process had taken 2 weeks. They had extracted DNA from the femur bone recovered from the quarry. Because of the age and degradation of the sample, nuclear DNA was fragmented. But mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed down directly from mother to daughter, was more robust. They had the reference sample, the hairbrush from 1984. The computer monitor displayed 2 sequences. They were strings of letters, A, C, T, G. The top row was the hairbrush. The bottom row was the femur. Aris scrolled through the hypervariable regions. These were the sections of the DNA strand that mutated quickly, creating a unique signature for a maternal line. Region 1, she whispered. Match. She scrolled. Region 2, match. She checked the control points, every base pair aligned. The probability of a random match was 1 in 3 billion. The door to the lab opened. Marcus walked in. He held a cup of coffee in each hand. He set one down on the desk. "Well?" he asked.
Aris didn't look at him immediately. She printed the report, the machine word, spitting out a single sheet of paper with a graph and a conclusion block. She picked it up. She handed it to him. Marcus put on his reading glasses. He looked at the bottom of the page. In forensic terms, quote, 481, quote, was the highest form of certainty. It meant that the person in the quarry and the person who owned the hairbrush shared the same mother. Marcus said. He folded the paper. He placed it in his breast pocket, right over his heart. Quote, 484, Aris asked. Quote, 485, Marcus said. Quote, 486. He turned off the lights in the lab, leaving only the glow of the computer screen. The blue light illuminated the sequence of letters, the code that had finally spoken the name of the lost. Marcus said into the darkness. He turned to Aris. They walked out into the corridor. The case was closed. The timeline was complete. The silence that followed was not empty, it was finished. The hallway outside the DNA laboratory was a vacuum of sound, the kind of heavy, pressurized silence that settles over municipal buildings after the cleaning crews have finished their rounds, but before the morning shift begins. The linoleum stretched out in a long, gleaming ribbon of grey, scuffed by decades of rubber soles and the rolling wheels of evidence carts. Marcus walked with the heavy, flat-footed gait of a man carrying a distinct physical weight, though his hands were empty. The single sheet of paper burned a psychological hole in his pocket, a heat source against his chest. It was lighter than air, yet it contained 40 years of speculation, heartbreak, and false leads. Aris walked a half-step behind him. She was younger, her fatigue different, sharper, more wired. She was vibrating with the scientific high of resolution. For her, the puzzle was solved. The molecular arithmetic had balanced. But as she watched the slope of Marcus's shoulders, she understood that for him, the equation had merely changed variables. The who was answered. The where was the quarry. But the how and the why had just risen from their shallow graves to demand attention. They reached the elevator banks. Marcus pressed the button. It lit up with a dirty amber glow. Marcus said, his voice gravelly, sounding like tires on a wet driveway. She's 49. She said, 4. This is 49. She said, 4. She said, 6111. She said, 4. Marcus said, she river. She said, she meta. She admitted, hugging them force. She founding way that she find the more force. She folks her, she said, she fine. She find for 49. She find them with a fuge. She admitted. She find the first more. She find them with a fuge. She admitted, hugging the wide. She find. She had true that, she said from there. She said, she find. She find the 4. Marcus said, his voice gravelly, sounding like tires on a wet driveway. Marcus said, his voice gravelly. She said, she find. She said from there. She find the 1. She said, she find. She had 50, she said. She find. Marcus said, his voice. She remember, the moment, she said. She said, she find. She said, she find. She asked the slope of Marcus's shoulders. She answered, hugging like tires on a wet driveway. She admitted, hugging her arms across her chest.
The air conditioning in the building was set to a permanent,
subterranean chill to protect the servers and the samples. Marcus noted. The elevator doors rattled open. They stepped inside. The metal box smelled of industrial sanitizer and stale cologne. As they descended, Marcus watched the floor numbers tick down on the LED display. 4, 3, 2, Eris asked. She didn't need to specify who her was. There was only one person left in the equation who mattered as much as the victim. It's 3 in the morning, Marcus said. Does that matter? No, he sighed, watching the doors part at the lobby level. No, I suppose it doesn't. Waiting until sunrise feels like a lie. Every minute we hold the truth, it's like we're stealing it from her. They walked out into the lobby. The night sergeant, a man named Miller who was mostly moustache and belly, looked up from a crossword puzzle. He saw the look on Marcus's face, the grim, hollowed-out expression of a bearer of news, and he didn't ask a single joke or offer a pleasantry. He just nodded, a somber acknowledgement of the trade they were all in. Marcus pushed through the heavy glass double doors and into the night. The weather had turned. The earlier humidity had broken into a cold, persistent drizzle that slicked the asphalt of the parking lot and haloed the street lamps in misty gauze. The city smelled of wet concrete, exhaust, and the rotting leaves of autumn. It was the smell of October, the smell of things ending. Marcus said, moving toward his unmarked sedan. It wasn't a question, and he wasn't offering Eris a ride. He needed the capsule of the car, the isolation of the drive. Eris said, stopping at her own car, a compact hatchback 2 spots over. Marcus warned, his hand on the door handle. Marcus got into his car. The interior was a sanctuary of old coffee cups and silence. He turned the key, and the engine rumbled to life, the wipers sweeping across the windshield with a rhythmic thwump, hiss. He sat there for a moment, letting the heat blast against his cold hands. He reached into his pocket and touched the folded paper again, just to ensure it hadn't evaporated. Elena Vance. He remembered the first time he'd heard the name. It was 1984. He had been a patrol officer, fresh out of the academy, eager and naive. The missing person report had come in on a Tuesday. A teacher, a mother. She had gone to the grocery store for milk and bread and had simply ceased to exist between the checkout counter and her driveway. The car had been found 2 days later, parked on a logging road 10 miles away, unlocked, keys in the ignition. The milk had soured in the back seat. The bread had gone stale. For 40 years, that sour milk had been the lingering taste of the department's failure. Marcus put the car in gear and pulled out of the lot. He didn't head toward his apartment. He turned east, toward the older suburbs, the part of town where the houses were built in the 50s, sturdy brick ranches that were now settling into their foundations like tired old men settling into armchairs. The drive was 20 minutes. Marcus drove on autopilot, his mind replaying the timeline. 1984, disappearance, massive search, nothing. 1989, declared legally dead. 1995, the husband, Thomas Vance, dies of a heart attack. Some said it was a broken heart. Marcus knew it was whiskey and undiagnosed hypertension, exacerbated by the suspicion that hung over him until his dying breath. Everyone always blamed the husband. 2004, the cold case unit is formed. Marcus takes the file. 2014, new leads on a serial offender in the tri-state area. Dead end. 2024, the quarry expansion project. An excavator operator sees something white that isn't limestone. The femur, the fragment of a pelvis. And now, the confirmation. Marcus turned onto Elm Street. The neighborhood was sleeping. Blue, flickering lights from televisions danced in a few windows, insomniacs watching infomercials. The trees here were old oaks, their branches creating a tunnel over the road. He slowed down as he approached number 404. The house was well kept but modest. A single story, yellow siding, white shutters. A tricycle sat in the middle of the driveway, a grandchild perhaps. Sarah Vance had been 6 years old when her mother vanished. She was 46 now.
She had lived her entire life in the shadow of a question mark. She had grown up, married, divorced, and raised a child of her own, all while waiting for a door to open or a phone to ring. Marcus pulled to the curb and killed the engine. The silence rushed back in, louder than the motor. He stepped out into the rain. He didn't bother with an umbrella. The water felt cleansing, or perhaps penance. He walked up the concrete path. He noticed the cracks in the walkway had been sealed with fresh tar. Someone was taking care of the place. He reached the door. He checked his watch. 3:42 a.m. There is no good way to wake someone up to tell them their mother is dead. There is only the necessary way. He knocked. 3 sharp raps. The sound echoed through the wood, feeling aggressively loud in the quiet night. He waited. A minute passed. He knocked again, harder this time. A light flicked on in the hallway. He saw the shadow move across the frosted glass of the door. The deadbolt slid back with a metallic clack. The chain rattled. The door opened 3 inches. Sarah Vance peered out. She was wearing a faded, oversized t-shirt and clutching a robe around her neck. Her hair was messy, her eyes puffy with sleep. But the moment she saw Marcus, the moment she saw the badge clipped to his belt and the somber set of his jaw, the sleep vanished. Her eyes widened. She knew him. He had visited her once a year for the last 20 years. "Detective?" she whispered. Her voice was trembling. "Sarah," Marcus said softly. "May I come in?" She didn't move for a second. She stared at him, searching his face for the code. If he was here at 3:42 a.m., it wasn't to ask questions. It wasn't to check a detail. She unlocked the chain with shaking fingers. She opened the door wide. She couldn't finish the sentence. She backed away into the hallway, her hands coming up to cover her mouth. Marcus stepped inside and closed the door behind him, shutting out the rain and the night. The house smelled of lavender and old paper. "We got the results back from the lab an hour ago," Marcus said. He didn't want to drag it out. He didn't want to give her false hope or torture her with preamble. Sarah stopped retreating. She stood by the small telephone table in the hall. A picture of her mother sat there. Elena in 1983, smiling, wind-blown hair, vibrant and alive. "And?" Sarah choked out. Marcus reached into his pocket. He took out the paper. He didn't unfold it. He just held it, a talisman of truth. Sarah didn't scream. She didn't collapse. That was the thing about long grief. It calcified the soul. Instead, she let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob, a sudden expulsion of breath, as if she had been holding it for 40 years. She slumped against the wall, sliding down slowly until she was sitting on the floor, her knees pulled to her chest. Marcus knelt beside her. He didn't touch her. He gave her the space to process the collapse of the maybe. As long as Elena was missing, she was Schrödinger's mother, both dead and alive, potentially starting a new life in Mexico, potentially having amnesia in a hospital in Seattle. Now she was bone in a box. The fantasy was dead. The reality was absolute. She asked into her knees. Marcus said gently. Sarah began to weep. It wasn't the hysterical crying of fresh shock. It was the deep, guttural keening of ancient wounds being ripped open to finally be cleaned out. She cried for the 6-year-old girl who waited by the window. She cried for the father who died, suspecting everyone thought he was a monster. She cried for the empty seat at her wedding and the grandmother her son never knew. Marcus waited. He was a sentinel of her grief. He had done this 100 times, but this one felt heavier. This was the closing of a book that had been open his entire career. Eventually, the sobbing subsided into ragged breaths. Sarah wiped her face with the sleeve of her robe. She looked up at Marcus, her eyes red and raw. "Where is she?" Sarah asked. Is she at the morgue?" "She's at the medical examiner's facility," Marcus said. "You don't need to identify her visually. We've done that scientifically. It's better that way." Sarah nodded, understanding the subtext. There is nothing left to recognize. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Marcus said, shifting his weight, his knees popping. We release the remains to you for burial. You can finally put her to rest next to your father. And the investigation? Sarah's voice hardened slightly. The grief was momentarily shelved, replaced by the need for justice. Now that we know it's her, do we know who did it? This was the pivot point, the moment the missing persons case became a confirmed homicide. Marcus sighed. Finding her gives us evidence we didn't have before, Sarah. The site where she was found, the quarry, it tells us things. The condition of the remains tells us things. Now that we have the body, the forensic anthropologists can look for cause of death. They can look for tool marks on the bones, defensive wounds. We couldn't do that when she was just a ghost. He stood up and offered her a hand. She took it, her grip surprisingly strong. He pulled her to her feet.
I can't promise you a name tonight, Marcus said, looking her in the eye.
But I can promise you that the clock has restarted. We aren't looking for a missing woman anymore. We are hunting a killer. And I'm not retiring until I close that part of the file too. Sarah looked at the photo of her mother on the table. She reached out and touched the glass. She was 29, Sarah whispered. She was younger than I am now. I know. Thank you, Marcus, she said, for not giving up, for keeping the hairbrush. I never throw anything away, Marcus said. He stayed for another hour. He made her tea. He waited until her son woke up, sleepy-eyed and confused, and watched her hug the boy with a ferocity that spoke of generational trauma being halted. When Marcus finally left the house, the sun was threatening the horizon. The rain had stopped, leaving the world scoured and reflective. The sky was a bruised purple, transitioning to a pale, watery grey.
He got back into his car. He was exhausted, his bones aching, his eyes gritty, but his mind was already shifting gears. He picked up his radio mic. "Dispatch, this is Detective Thorne." "Go ahead, Thorne. Update the status on case file 84-092. Change classification from missing person to homicide. And get me the crime scene tech team on the line. I want to go back to the quarry." "Copy that, Thorne. At this hour?" "The light's coming up," Marcus said, looking through the windshield at the dawn breaking over the wet suburban rooftops. "It's the best time to see what was hidden." He put the car in drive. He wasn't going home to sleep. The quarry was a scar on the earth, a vast terraced amphitheatre of grey limestone located 10 miles outside the city limits. It had been abandoned in the 90s, then reopened recently for a municipal drainage project. That was how they found her, an excavator bucket scraping against the side of a spoil pile that hadn't been touched since the Reagan administration. Marcus parked his car at the rim of the pit. The yellow police tape from 2 weeks ago was still fluttering in the morning breeze, soggy and limp. Aris was already there. She hadn't gone home either. She was standing by the tailgate of a crime scene van, pulling on a white Tyvek suit. Marcus walked over, his shoes crunching on the gravel. "Marcus said." Aris replied, zipping up the suit. Marcus stopped. Aris handed him a tablet. The screen showed a 3D render of the femur and the partial pelvis they had recovered. Aris said, pointing to the screen. Marcus squinted at the image. "Yes," Aris said. Her voice was clinical, detached, the way she handled horror. Marcus looked up from the screen, staring into the abyss of the quarry. Aris said. Marcus looked up at the rim of the femur, and 555. Marcus looked up from the femur. It was a 50-foot drop to the first terrace. Marcus said, his voice flat. Aris said. The image hit Marcus with the force of a physical blow. Elena Vance, broken and alone in the dark of the quarry 40 years ago. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Marcus said. Aris said. Aris swiped the screen to a new image. It was a microscopic magnification of the bone surface. Quote 565, quote 566, quote 567, quote, Aris said. Marcus stared at her. Aris corrected. Marcus turned to look at the logging road that wound its way up the back of the hill, the road that led to the cliffs overlooking the pit. Marcus reasoned. Aris finished. Marcus said,
his resolve hardening into steel. He walked toward the edge of the cliff. The sun had fully breached the horizon now, bathing the grey rock in a harsh, indifferent light. The quarry looked like a moonscape. Marcus shouted to the lead tech down on the terrace. He felt the vibration of his phone in his pocket. He pulled it out. It was the chief. Marcus answered. The chief's voice was clipped. The chief said. Marcus said, "You couldn't have that." Marcus believed that false. It was perfectly known that they will look like. The world watching the forensic team move like white beetles across the grey rock below. Marcus said. He hung up. He stood on the ledge, the wind whipping his trench coat. He felt a strange sense of connection to the woman who had lain down there for 4 decades. He had carried her file for half his life. He had memorized her face. Now, he was standing over her grave. Quote, 593, he whispered to the wind. Quote, 594. Aris stepped up beside him. She held a travel mug of coffee out to him. Quote, 595, she said. Marcus took the coffee. It was hot, bitter, and black. It tasted like fuel. Quote, 596, he said. Quote, _597. Marcus said, 598, sipping the coffee. Quote, _600. Aris, help to Floyer for flams. 600. Aris looked impressed. Quote, 601, Marcus said. Quote, 602. Quote, 603. Quote, 604, Marcus said. Quote, 605. Quote, 606. Aris typed the name into her tablet. Quote, 607. She tapped the screen for a few seconds, the 5G connection struggling in the quarry bowl. She read. Aris paused. She said. Marcus felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It was the feeling of the tumblers clicking into place. Marcus said, turning back toward the car. The Ironwood district was a grid of rusted chain-link fences and small industrial lots that had slowly been converted into cheap housing. Stanislav Kovich's house was a bungalow wrapped in vinyl siding that had peeled in the sun. The yard was a graveyard of old mechanical parts, lawnmowers, engines, twisted metal. Marcus pulled the car up the driveway. He didn't turn on the siren. He didn't want to spook the prey. He and Aris got out. Marcus adjusted his jacket, feeling the weight of his service weapon on his hip. He hadn't drawn it in 10 years, but today the weight felt reassuring. They walked up the porch steps. The wood groaned under their feet. Marcus knocked. The door opened almost immediately, as if the occupant had been watching them. Stanislav Kovich was a mountain of a man who had begun to erode. His shoulders were broad but stooped. His belly hung over his belt, and his face was a map of broken capillaries and deep, craggy lines. He held a lit cigarette in one hand and a mug of coffee in the other. He wore a grease-stained undershirt. He looked at Marcus, then at Aris. His eyes were watery blue, faded like old denim. He didn't look surprised. He looked resigned. Kovich rasped. His voice sounded like gravel in a cement mixer. Marcus asked. He corrected. Kovich took a long drag of his cigarette. The cherry glowed bright orange. He exhaled a cloud of blue smoke that drifted past Marcus's face. Kovich muttered. Marcus said. He didn't blink. He stared directly into the man's eyes, looking for the flinch, the twitch, the dilation of the pupil. Found who? Kovich feigned ignorance, but his hand tightened slightly on the doorframe. Elena Vance. The name hung in the air between them, suspended in the cigarette smoke. Kovich didn't speak for a long time. He looked past Marcus, toward the street, toward the past. Quote, 630, he said finally. Quote, 631, Marcus said. Kovich let out a short, dry laugh. It sounded like a cough. Aris interjected. She stepped forward, her voice sharp. Kovich's eyes snapped to Aris. For the first time there was fear there. Not guilt necessarily, but fear. The science scared him. the magic of the future reaching back to judge the past. Kovic whispered. Marcus said. Kovic looked at his cigarette. It had burned down to the filter. He dropped it on the porch and crushed it out with his slippered foot. Kovic said, "It was a statement of fact, devoid of emotion." Marcus said. Kovic repeated,
looking up at Marcus. The world seemed to stop spinning for a second. Marcus felt his heart hammer against his ribs. Kovic leaned against the doorframe, his body sagging as if the structural integrity of his secrets had finally given way. Kovic said softly. Marcus demanded. Kovic looked at Marcus with a mixture of pity and contempt. Marcus froze. The political landscape of the city shifted under his feet. Marcus asked, his voice barely a whisper. Kovic corrected. Kovic looked at his hands, stained with the grease of a lifetime of labor. Kovic said. He looked up at Marcus, his eyes wet. Marcus looked at Aris. Her face was pale. They had gone looking for a ghost and found a monster living in the city hall. Marcus said, The interrogation room was a sterile box of white walls and buzzing fluorescent lights. It was a place designed to strip away the comforting illusions of the outside world. Marcus sat opposite Stan Kovic. A video camera blinked a steady red eye in the corner. Marcus said, 660. We couldn't took a sip of water from a plastic cup. His hands were shaking now. The reality of what he was doing, implicating the mayor, was setting in. The 6-3. Marcus closed his eyes for a second. Elena Vance. 667. 68. 69. 70. 671. 672. Kovic hesitated. He looked at the camera, then at Marcus. Marcus nodded slowly. Elena Vance had been wearing a blue wool coat when she disappeared. Kovic said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Marcus said. Kovic said. Marcus leaned back in his chair. He had the statement, he had the motive, he had the witness. But Richard Sterling was the mayor. He was powerful. He was insulated. Marcus stood up. He walked out of the room into the observation area. Aris was there, watching the monitor. The chief was standing next to her, his face the color of ash. Marcus asked. The chief said. He looked sick. Marcus said, ticking off the points on his fingers. The chief said weakly. Marcus said. The chief said. Marcus said to Aris. Aris said, her fingers flying across her laptop. A moment of tense silence filled the small room. Aris said. 700. 701. Aris said. 702. 703. Marcus said, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of the hunt. 704. 705. Marcus told the chief. 706. 707. The chief warned. 708. 709. Marcus said. 710. The arrest happened 3 days later. It didn't happen quietly. Marcus insisted on that. He wanted the cameras there. He wanted the world to see that time did not grant immunity. They found the truck in a barn in Chillicothe. It was rusted, beaten, and used for hauling manure, but the chassis was intact. Aris and her team dismantled it piece by piece. Behind the front bumper bracket, preserved in a glob of 40-year-old grease and road tar, they found 3 hairs. Mitochondrial DNA analysis confirmed they belonged to Elena Vance. Richard Sterling was arrested at a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a new park. He was smiling, holding a pair of giant scissors when Marcus walked up the steps of the gazebo. The crowd went silent. The press cameras turned from the ribbon to the badge. Richard Sterling, Marcus said, his voice projecting over the microphone system. You are under arrest for the murder of Elena Vance. Sterling dropped the scissors. The sound clattered on the wooden floor. His face went slack, the politician's mask slipping to reveal the terrified boy underneath. Sterling stammered, unknowingly confessing into the hot mic. Marcus said. He pulled out the cuffs. They were cold and heavy silver.
1 month later. The cemetery was quiet. The leaves had fallen, leaving the trees bare and skeletal against the November sky. A small group gathered around the open grave. Sarah Vance stood at the front, holding her son's hand. She was dressed in black, but her face was peaceful. The question mark was gone. Marcus stood at the back, near the tree line. He wore his dress uniform, the brass buttons shining. They lowered the small casket into the ground. It contained the bones from the quarry, the femur, the pelvis, the fragments they had sifted from the dirt. It wasn't much, but it was her. The priest spoke of peace and rest. Sarah threw a handful of dirt onto the lid. It made a hollow thud that signaled the end. When the service was over, the mourners drifted away. Sarah remained for a moment, staring at the headstone. She turned and saw Marcus. She walked over to him. Quote, 716, she said. Quote, 717, Marcus said. Quote, 718, Sarah said. Quote, 719. Quote, 720, Marcus said. Sarah reached out and took Marcus's hand. She squeezed it. 721, she said softly. 722. Marcus looked at the grave, then at the horizon. The weight in his chest, the one he had carried since 1984, was gone. It was replaced by a strange lightness, a sense of space. 723, Marcus said. He walked Sarah to her car. He watched her drive away, back to her life, back to a future that was no longer tethered to a tragic past. Marcus walked back to his own car. Aris was leaning against the hood, waiting for him. She had a file folder in her hand. Quote 724, she said. Quote 725, Marcus agreed. Quote 726. He looked at the folder in her hand. Quote 727, he asked. Aris hesitated. She looked at him with a mix of apology and excitement. Quote 728, she said. Quote 729. Marcus sighed. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Quote 730. Quote 731, Aris said. Quote 732. Marcus looked at his car keys. He looked at the cemetery gate. He thought about fishing, about sleeping in, about reading books that weren't case files. Then he looked at Aris and the spark in her eyes. He felt the pull of the puzzle, the obligation to the nameless bones waiting in the evidence lockers. A name, Marcus repeated. Just a potential name, Aris said. Needs verification, needs footwork. Marcus opened the car door. Get in, he said. Where are we going? Ohio, Marcus said, starting the engine. Let's go find out who she was. The engine roared to life. They pulled out of the cemetery, leaving the dead to their rest, and drove back into the world of the living, where there were still questions to be answered and names to be found. The case of Elena Vance was closed. The file was shelved, but the work continued. Marcus drove. The road stretched out before them, long and winding, but for the first time in 40 years, the rear-view mirror was clear.